Hi, I'm Amy Booth, the managing editor of the Buenos Aires Herald, and I'm here tonight for our first event, which is about what it's like covering Argentina for international audiences. I'm here with our panel guests Squires, a markets reporter in Argentina for Bloomberg, and Brigida, a correspondent for Reuters. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, welcome. It's great to see that so many of you were able to make it tonight and were interested in coming along. As Estefania said, this is the first time that we've done an event as the Herald since we relaunched, but we hope it won't be the last. In fact, we think it's going to be the first of many. So, as she mentioned, I'm the managing editor here. I joined the team, the team all joined back in December and we relaunched on the 24th of March this year. It's fantastic to have the Herald back around as an English language space for good quality information about Argentina. We know that a lot of the people who read us are people in the international community in Argentina and people abroad who are interested in Argentina. So with that in mind, we decided that the topic of our first event today was going to be the challenges of explaining Argentina to foreign audiences. So to that end, I'm joined by Brigida, a correspondent for Reuters here in Argentina, and Squires, who's a markets reporter for Bloomberg here in Argentina. I've got a few questions, and then there'll also be plenty of time for you to ask some questions of your own at the end. Great. So without further ado, I wanted to start by asking each of you, I'm going to start with you because I was looking this way. Why did you choose to come to Argentina to work as a journalist? And if you could also let us know a bit about where you've reported from before and what it's like here as opposed to elsewhere.
Sure. So I guess what I would say is that I didn't choose Argentina, but Argentina chose me. The reason I came down to Argentina, I guess I'll back up, tell you the story. I'm from Texas. I previously in a previous life had worked as a photojournalist, freelancing and doing a number of different photo stories for local outlets in Texas and around Austin. And I decided I wanted more out of my journalism career. So I went back to school and focused on the writing and got a master's degree in international policy studies. So while I was doing that, I continued writing and I started covering news out of Mexico quite a fair bit, just by convenience from being so close. So I traveled down to Mexico City or to the southern border in Chiapas and report on immigration or environmental issues or various other stories. And so Argentina really wasn't on my radar. I didn't know anything about it until I got a fellowship from an organization called the Overseas Press Club Foundation. They're based out of New York and they help a lot of young foreign correspondents get their start. I applied for a fellowship with them and graciously they gifted it to me or gave it to me. And they said, would you go to Argentina? And I said, well, yeah, I don't know anything about it, but why not? So I landed in Argentina in 2018 knowing nothing about the economic situation. I started meeting journalists like Amy and other journalists at Reuters and started just really hitting the ground running and getting up to speed on what inflation is. Very basic stuff.
How times change.
How times change. Right, so that's how I got my start down here, and I just really have never left. I've loved it ever since. It's been quite a roller coaster.
Great. And what about you, Anakat?
So I have traveled around quite a bit in Latin America. I studied journalism at USC in Los Angeles, and I sort of always wanted to go into foreign journalism. And I first came to Argentina in 2014. I did my study abroad semester here. So this was the first place where I traveled in Latin America, started to learn a lot more about Latin American history, also learn a lot more about human rights and a lot of the history of Argentina as a country where they have a very strong history of being at the forefront of human rights and in terms of after the dictatorship in the 1980s and really being an example to the region. So I started to learn a lot about that. when I was studying abroad. That was sort of my intro to Argentina. And as I said, that was in 2008, that was in 2014, so quite a while ago. And then I sort of took another roundabout route to get back here. When I graduated in 2015, I ended up moving to Central America. So I spent most of the past 7 years in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And I sort of always, in the back of my mind, wanted to come back to Argentina. When I was in Central America, I was working as a freelancer, and I just recently moved back here, relocated for a new job as a correspondent with Reuters. So I'm just really excited to be back and feel like it's sort of a full circle moment.
Fantastic. And so could you tell me a little bit about like what topics you cover here and what you've been reporting on?
Yeah, so as a correspondent for Reuters, I can cover a bit of everything. I think in general as a foreign correspondent, we're obviously looking towards a foreign audience, so looking at sort of the issues that are most of interest to a foreign audience. So of course, Argentina, economics and inflation are a big issue to cover, as well as the elections coming up, so politics. I've also, when I was in Central America, I was covering a lot of immigration, women's rights and reproductive rights. I think as a freelancer and also as a foreign correspondent, sometimes you are kind of covering a little bit of everything. You don't necessarily specialize in just one thing or another. You kind of can be covering a little bit of whatever is the important topic of the moment.
Yeah, and so you've been here since February, right? And before that, you'd been all over the place in Central America. Could you tell me a little bit about your impressions of the differences between Argentina and like the Central American countries you were working on? Because I know, for instance, that you've written a couple of stories about like Argentina now has legal abortion, and so we're continuing to see developments on that even 2-3 years down the line. I know you've been looking at that a bit, and I think that must be a contrast because you worked in El Salvador before, where there's famously a complete ban.
Yeah, so one of my last stories from El Salvador was actually about the criminalization of abortion there and looking at some of the cases. So. Of women who've been imprisoned for abortion-related crimes. So in El Salvador, abortion is illegal under all circumstances, as well as in Honduras. So that was a sort of key coverage area for me when I was in Central America. And so it's been really interesting to look here and sort of look at that issue in a completely different way, because here they're sort of going in a different direction, making some advances in terms of making reproductive rights more accessible, making abortion more accessible. One of my first sort of feature stories that I did here was about how they're making abortion pills here more accessible and how that has an impact on health here. So I'm kind of seeing how there's a different approach here, but also kind of, I think, drawing on some of my experiences reporting before and sort of seeing how there's different kind of trends in the region, but how different countries are handling things differently.
Yeah, cool. And so you deal with like pretty hardcore financial stuff a lot of the time, right? Would you like to tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure, no, absolutely. Well, I did want to just respond one thing to what Anna Katz said, is that as a foreign correspondent, you have to be a jack of all trades and kind of cover anything and everything. And even though my basis really is economics and finance and Argentine markets, I do jump in on random things here and there, and that's just part of being here and doing that, right? Yeah,
like there was, until I think last December, if you'd asked me like, is there one area of journalism that I've never done, that I've never touched, it would have been sports journalism. That was until Argentina won the World Cup. So like I found myself we were all sports journalists for a month. We were all sports journalists for a month, yeah.
Yeah, so there is a bit of everything, but my bread and butter sort of day to day is reporting on financial markets, economics and finance of Argentina, which, as everyone in this room knows, is a huge topic of conversation. It invades everything and every daily transaction that we have in this country. So really my goal, I think, as an economics correspondent, a finance correspondent, is to make some of these topics a little bit more digestible. Because if you're like me, I didn't know what a bond was, when I started at Bloomberg. Now I write about bonds, right? And so it's about making some of those sort of indigestible topics a little bit more digestible, a little bit easier to break down, and explaining the complexities of Argentina, not only Argentina, but finance in general, to a wider audience. Now, Argentina is kind of its own beast within that, right? They say that there are 4 different types of economies in the world: developed, developing, Argentina, and Japan. So we have a special sort of designation. So a lot of my day-to-day, the stories that I look for, the stories that I write, are often about those weird eccentricities of how Argentine traders are arbitraging this bond versus this exchange rate, or how the dollar soja is impacting exports, or which is it has to do a lot with the government's heterodox policies that they're always trying to sort of solve the latest crisis or the last problem. So we try to pick those apart, try to present them in a digestible way, and often, of course, always try to break news on what's happening.
Yeah, and I mean, it is difficult sometimes, isn't it, thinking of how to even explain, like, the gist of it is that we have people who are buying and selling these particular things back and forth in this particular order because it makes them a bunch of money. Right. And then there's like a bunch of variants on a theme there.
Sure.
And so, like, kind of related to that, because I know that some of these can sometimes feel a bit silly. It's like, oh, they're doing that. Could you tell me about some of the most rewarding reporting that you've done, like, since you've been in Argentina?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any time that I get to write a really human story, I think is a win for me, and I guess a win for journalism, because at the end of the day, we want to know what the human impact of these policies and these economics are on people here in Argentina. So anytime I can, get out into the street and talk to people about how inflation is actually impacting their business, and learning a bit about how, what they do as a small cafe owner, for instance, to shield their business against inflation, or at least just sobrevivir, right? Just surviving in this is always a rewarding experience to me, because it sort of teaches me about Argentina's resilience, which I think is a very strong trait here.
And can you think of any particularly rewarding or like striking examples where someone told you something that maybe made you see it in a different way, or just made you think, "Oof, imagine having to deal with that"?
Here's a story that I worked on a few months ago about Russian migrants coming to Argentina. It was in a lot of different papers, but I started noticing these folks in my local park. They're all pushing baby strollers and speaking Russian. I'm like, that's new. But getting to know a bunch of those folks and hearing about their experiences really fleeing a situation that is even more dire than Argentina economically, and certainly politically, there's a different sort of set of circumstances there. And just presenting the two circumstances side by side, Russia and Argentina, and seeing that these people would much rather be in Argentina, made me realize again, this place is actually pretty good in a lot of respects. So that was one really moving, I think, experience for me, to get to meet a lot of those people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this strange sensation of, like, I've never lived in Argentina and not been surrounded by people saying that there's a crisis, and it's this kind of like dual sense that, like, yeah, it's true, a lot of people are having a really hard time here, but also there's so much that we can value about Argentina, and like everything that's going right and everything that we appreciate about it, and it's important to tell those stories as well. And what about you? What are some of your favorite pieces from here so far?
Well, as I said, I'm kind of just getting started here, but I do think I really like what Scott said just about, speaking to people. It's always very rewarding, hearing those personal stories. And whenever people, open up and share those personal stories with you, I think it's one of the most rewarding parts of journalism. Sort of mentioned already one of the stories that I did on reproductive rights. That was very, had some very personal stories about what it meant to some people to have access to certain medications that were not available before. And I think that was very rewarding to have those, not just be able to tell that story and talk about, there's now this medication available, but actually tell the stories of, what it actually means and how it's going to change the experiences for people. So I think that was rewarding.
So is this the story about them widening access to mifepristone?
Yes, thank you, Amy.
Yeah.
I will clarify a little bit more. So mifepristone is one of the 2 pills that is widely used in abortions, and in the US they're currently discussing a potential ban on that pill.
And that would be bad news because it's like you can use misoprostol on its own, but like the results are like it's a lot harder, right? And mifepristone is like required medicine, or it's like it's on the list of essential medicines according to the World Health Organization. And yet, despite that fact, even though there was some circumstances where abortion was legal here, it was not actually possible or easy to get for a long time.
Yes,
so like it was
exactly.
a huge deal.
Yeah, so this was basically just I think in March or May, May, that they made it official here that you can now access this pill. So it is a big step. It changes a lot, the experience that women and other people who are able to get pregnant, what they go through when they have an abortion. So I thought that was something that was important.
Yeah, and I think that and like the improved access to like the morning after pill as well. And these are the kinds of stories that like the major newspapers, they're not, they'll report on like the major change of abortion has been broadly legalized, for instance, but they're not necessarily going to go into this detail of like, okay, now you can get this pill, now you can get that pill. But that can actually be really, really important. Like knowing whether or not you can get the morning after pill in a country, like you don't realize you need that information until you really need it. And like there are countries where it's illegal, like in Honduras, it's illegal, right? Or they're in the process of legalizing it. And so like I think having spaces like the Herald, where we're actually really on top of every update because we're based here and we're not doing like parachute correspondence is really important. So what do you find it hard to translate? Because like there's Spanish and then there's like Argentine Spanish and lunfardo and River Plate Spanish, and then there's like these concepts that it's like, ooh, how would you say that?
Yeah, there's a lot. I do feel like in general, it's one thing that is always difficult when you're reporting in Spanish, and then sometimes there's just like certain quotes when you're in the interview and you're like, oh, that's a great quote. And then you go to listen to it and then you try to translate it and you're just like, oh, it just doesn't have the same feeling when you put it into English. So when I recently was doing an interview and someone was talking about the different exchange rates and how he kind of, moved his money in one way to get a certain exchange rate. And so I asked him, like, well, why don't you do it this way? And then he said, well, basically he was like, well, the government's not going to give you that exchange rate. But what he said in Spanish was like, ni en pedo el gobierno te da dólares, or something like that. And they said, ni en pedo, and he just kept saying it. And it was like a funny moment in the interview. And I was like, oh, that would be maybe like a good quote. But then I was like, what am I gonna write like in English? And whatever I would translate it to, it wouldn't translate, because even if I could think of, something to say, it's just a very Argentine phrase.
Yeah, it's like, if there's anyone here that doesn't speak Spanish, I think probably most of you do, but it's like, not in farts way, like a pedo is a fart, or like, The other, for me, it's often protest slogans that just, they don't have the same ring to it. So like, ni una menos, it's like, it's often translated as not one single woman fewer, and it's like, you can't shout that in the streets in the same way. Or que se vayan todos, it's like, it's just this kind of the way that it's like this kind of will that it can be really difficult to kind of get across, I think, a lot of the time.
There's an eloquence in Spanish that sometimes that, you know, those phrases capture that English can't quite do. For me, it's often, you know, various tipos de cambio, trying to explain what all those are. I mean, not just like what the heck dollar Coldplay is, but also dollar blue, a black market dollar, which incidentally, weirdly the same thing, but two different colors. Also, they're greenbacks, so they're colors. We're talking about pesos. We have papel pintado.
Oh, but don't forget that we've got like the dollar blue and then the blue chip swap.
And then the blue chip swap, of course, which are not the same thing, but they're both coded the same color for some reason. So my stories end up being a rainbow of various different exchange rates and for pride, you know.
Yeah, and like things that I find it hard to explain, it's not just about like the terms themselves. I think there are sometimes just the ways that things are structured here that it's like, it takes quite a lot of understanding. So for instance, we're in an electoral year, like every 2 or 3 weeks a different province is having an election, and trying to get people to understand, okay, so is this a party or is it a coalition? Because like, that's something that people often get confused. And so, you know, we're in this situation where we have the ruling coalition and the opposition coalition, and both of these are composed actually of several parties, and then like, there can be quite a broad ideological range between like maybe PRO, which is, you know, one of the more right-wing parties within Juntos por el Cambio, and maybe like the Radicales or the Coalición Cívica. And on the one hand, getting people to understand that kind of what's going on in party level and coalition level is not necessarily the same, and so you can have like victories between two parties in the same coalition, or sorry, of one party over the other in the same coalition. And then the fact that at provincial level, like the governors actually have quite a lot of power here. Like the more I cover provincial elections, the more I come to realize that actually these people can do quite a lot of stuff. So it's important to pay attention, or like a lot of presidents have been governors at some point, or the fact that sort of you may have people who are like opponents at national level, but they actually work together in a particular province, or like they run under a different name in a province, and so like that is a whole barrel of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to just add, even explaining the concept of Peronism, which is such a diverse sort of ideology that you can't say is completely left, or, you know, sometimes you have a Menem figure who is, you know, a Peronist, but was actually quite neoliberal in a lot of his policies. So there's all of these nuance. There's all this nuance always in covering anything, but I think in Argentina it's especially fuerte.
Yeah. And then what is happening here that you guys think deserves more attention internationally?
There's plenty of things happening here. I think what attention is being paid depends on who's writing it and who the audience is, you know. But I think on an international, like a very top level international sort of stage, I think definitely some of the. I know that one of your BA Herald journalists was writing about rewilding today. I think conservation efforts and environmental efforts in Argentina are something that really deserve a lot more attention on the global sort of stage of green journalism and environmental journalism. On that same token, I think the deforestation of the Chaco is a huge story that, you know, while it's been covered, and Reuters did a very good photo essay of it recently, which I encourage everyone to check out. And I think it's widely covered, but if you talk to anybody in Kansas, for instance, obviously the Amazon is being deforested, but they don't know that the second biggest rainforest or second biggest forested area in South America is also being deforested at sometimes an even faster rate, right? So there are all these sort of niche stories that, yes, they get covered in, sort of daily quotidian press or in Latin American press, that we should really strive to elevate.
Yeah, I think that was what I was going to mention as well, and I also think it's really interesting to look at how that intersects with the issue of indigenous rights, because like in provinces like Salta, Chaco, there are huge numbers of indigenous groups, huge numbers of indigenous communities living in really, really difficult situations, living in extreme poverty a lot of the time. And this is not something that gets a ton of coverage. And I mean, it's a human rights issue because,
Sure.
in some cases we see like child deaths from malnutrition, and like, when's the last time you read about that?
Absolutely. And one story, comes to mind that was in the press over the weekend, about the director James Cameron coming here to Argentina.
Yeah.
And sort of feeling ambushed by the governor of Jujuy to support a lithium extraction project when he didn't know that there was also an indigenous claim to that land. And for me, that sets up, look, we're storytellers at the end of the day, right? And what makes a good story is tension, two sides claiming different things. That to me is an amazing story between, how do we respect indigenous rights, but also open up Argentina to investment, or to the need for lithium to drive a green technology boom in electric vehicles and everything in the coming century. And so, how do you square those two claims, and how do you square those two needs? To me, that's an incredible place to explore that tension, right?
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I think just in general, sometimes with foreign correspondents, and just covering, a country for an outside audience, there can be a sort of tendency to sort of reduce a country to just, one issue. And in Argentina, the economic story has sort of always been the big issue. Inflation passed, 100% this year. It's obviously a very important issue. It has been for a long time and is at this moment, but I think that whenever we can sort of look at different issues, as Scott is mentioning, different environmental issues, different issues of indigenous rights, women's rights, and sort of be mindful to not sort of reduce any sort of country to one specific issue. I think it's really important to sort of think about how we're being mindful of how we portray, a country to an international audience.
That brings me neatly onto my next question. I have two questions left. So like, Argentina cliches that you hate and you wish we could ban, and that you think we should send people to word prison for saying that. Like,
I'll start with any headline that says "Don't cry for."
Yeah.
It takes two to tango.
Yeah.
The IMF and Argentina tango over $56 billion of whatever.
Yeah. I think it's sort of it can encourage reductionist approaches. Like, I think Valen, our editor, who is sitting in the audience somewhere, at one point mentioned a situation where I think it was a devaluation story, but this was a situation where people had just lost a bunch of money, like a lot of people had lost a significant chunk of their savings, and there's this slight tendency to be like, oh, silly Argentina and its economy, and it's like, this is people's livelihoods, like this is people's pensions, this is people's houses, and just to never lose sight of the fact that it's easy for people who are maybe covering this from like Europe or the States or whatever to be like, oh, there we go again, but like people have to live here and people have to survive.
Yeah, and I mean, Anna Kat mentioned not being reductionist about Argentina, and I don't think we certainly shouldn't do that, but we should remember that inflation is the biggest story, and devaluation and economic problems in Argentina is the biggest story always, because it touches everything else. Right. At the end of the day,
Yes.
it is the big story, because it gets into every portion of everybody's life always, no matter if you're in Jujuy or Ushuaia or here. So I guess rightly so, it is covered so extensively.
And it's really
it's related to politics too, absolutely.
Yeah. So my last question for both of you is, I know that there are a lot of journalists in the audience, a lot of people who've worked in press, or a lot of people who are maybe interested in writing more. What advice would you give to aspiring foreign correspondents?
Should I start off? I would say, I think that the biggest step is, to kind of just do it. If you're all here, then that's step number one. I think that I try not to be too dark about the state of journalism at the moment, but resources have been cut a bit, so there's a lot more people freelancing, which I think there's different ways to look at it, but in some ways it is an opportunity. I think there are in some ways lots of opportunities for young people to freelance, and I get a lot of people reaching out and being like, well, how do I do it? And it's you just send the pitch, you don't necessarily need an invitation. So that's one of the things that I tell them is that don't be afraid to kind of just get started, and also don't be afraid to reach out to people directly for advice. People do it to me all the time, and I always try to be helpful. So I'll start off with that and see what else Scott has.
Yeah, no, I would echo that. I think the most important thing is just getting out there and doing it. If you want to be a foreign correspondent, you need to move to that country where you want to be a foreign correspondent. Even if you don't have a job, figure it out. Either work beforehand and save enough money that you can live and freelance while you're chewing away at your savings, or figure out other ways to make money while you're doing it. Just get on the ground, have the language skills, start meeting the people, start doing the reporting, find the stories you want to write about, and start pitching like crazy. That's the only other way to do it. Use tools like Twitter. Journalists, as much as we hate Twitter, we also secretly love Twitter. So just DMing random people about either their experiences or this person's an editor. Say, hey, I'm interested in a pitch. Maybe you'll get a response, maybe you won't, but at least you tried. Just keep at it, and really it's about sending out all the calls and emails that you can do. So, which is like reporting, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the point I was going to make. And I think it's interesting also to think about this is foreign correspondence, because for us, we're kind of foreign correspondents in the sense that we came to a different country, but we also think it's super important to kind of strengthen the capacity of local communities to talk about what's going on themselves. So maybe the next managing editor of the Herald is not going to be someone who's British. I'm originally from the UK, but rather it's going to be an Argentine person who's been kind of trained to be able to communicate their reality abroad. And that's one of the things that we really hope to achieve with the Herald is to basically train up super talented young Argentine journalists, and they are super talented because I work with them every day, to be able to sort of put their own voice out in English abroad in a publication that we know is read internationally. So that's long may it live, long may it continue. We hope you enjoyed our first panel discussion at the Buenos Aires Herald. At the Herald, we want to be more than just a newspaper. We want to be a community. See you next time.